I'd like to share with you today a lesson from Africa. One of my colleagues in seminary is a priest from Tanzania. Her name is Tumaini. And even though she's already been ordained a priest and she's been a priest for several years, she's been sent to America because her superiors believe that she'll be a bishop in Tanzania someday. And if you're going to be a bishop in Africa someday, they think it's a good idea to understand how to deal with Americans. So she's been sent to Virginia to study with us. And so I sat next to her in our introduction to church history for beginners. And if I was ever bored, she must have been really bored, this already accomplished, bright woman. And so it was after Christmas that we had come to about the Enlightenment, and we got to Descartes' famous phrase, Je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore, I am. And everyone in my class raised their hand in a flurry and said everything we could to decry Western individualism, how it leads to jockeying for position, it leads to greed, it leads to loneliness, isolationism, and ultimately to despair. And Tumaini raised her hand after we had all said this, and she said, yes, that's right. I'm sorry you have that problem in the North Atlantic. We don't have that problem in Tanzania. We have other problems. But we don't have a phrase like that defines who we are. We have a different kind of phrase. Our phrase is, I am because we are. I am because we are. I've been reading the results of the study of youth and religion, which was conducted on my generation when we were in high school. And it's the largest study of religion ever conducted in the United States. 2,300 teenagers were interviewed. And one of the questions among hundreds was, what are some of the main tenets of Christianity? To you, what is the most important thing about Christianity? They were asking this because they wanted to see what my generation was being taught in church. The two most popular answers were, Christianity makes you feel good. Christianity makes you feel all right with where you are in life. Ultimately, Christianity makes you feel good and makes you feel successful. This is what we were being taught. When Christ was asked a similar question, love of God and love of neighbor were the two most important answers. And out of the 2,300 teens interviewed, 3 said love of neighbor was an important tenet of Christianity. Only 3. I'm also learning Greek at seminary. Try not to shudder. I was one of the few who stuck with Greek all year. There's an almost insurmountable amount of grammar, but once you learn all the rules, it's fun to apply them. It's like playing Axis and Allies. It takes a whole day to learn the rules, but then you get to play with it. So there are only 3 of us by the end. Only 3 of us are still studying Greek, and we were translating through the Gospel of John. So we started with the Logos hymn, that beautiful poetry at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we were immediately in trouble because we had learned the word for with, meta. The word was with God. And that's not the word the Johannine author used. And the Johannine author has great Greek, so he could have used the word meta if he'd wanted to. Instead, he uses the word pros hotheos. We had learned that word as a conjoiner word, like proskuneo. Kuneo means I bow. Proskuneo means I bow toward. That's the word for worship. Proskuneo, to bow toward. So we thought the word was toward God. Didn't really make sense. And it's hard to translate these socio-cultural things. So we did a little more research, and the best way we could describe it to ourselves was to think of it spatially. We use this word in English. We say pro and con, right? Pro comes from the Greek pros. So let's say I am pro-breakfast. There's a pro-breakfast camp and an anti-breakfast camp, and because I am in favor of bacon and eggs, I move toward breakfast, toward the pro camp. I am pros breakfast. So the translation isn't really the word was with God, that simple translation. It's the more complicated, the word was moving toward God. And not only that, it's a Greek tense, which means the word was moving toward God and continues to move toward God to this day. Now, what does that have to do with Trinity Sunday, exactly what with the National Study of Youth and Religion and our lesson from Africa. I think it colors the way we look at the Trinity. And I think the way I often view the Trinity is popular. I think I'm not alone in that. I view three great thrones up on a dais, God in the middle, Christ at the right-hand side, a seat saved for the Holy Spirit. And that's fine because that's biblical. We get that in Isaiah's vision of God. We get that in Paul's letter to the Hebrews. We get that later in John of Patmos's revelation. So it's fine, but it's static. It's distant. And I think it's safe for us to place the Trinity on a set of thrones out there somewhere. I think that allows us to go to God when we need God, but God doesn't crash into our lives when we're not heading toward that throne. And I think the word pros, this moving towards, is intrinsic to the nature of the Trinity. Christ was sent into the world. There's motion in that. Christ descended into hell. He rose from the dead. He ascended into heaven. The Holy Spirit descended like a dove at Christ's baptism. God moves upon the waters at the beginning of creation, and Christ, as wisdom, dances and rejoices by his side, as we heard in Proverbs this morning. There's a lot of movement in that. It's kinetic. It's dynamic. It's alive. It's not safe, exactly. We live in the age of the cult of health and wellness. And one of the tenets of that cult is centering yourself. We're told that if we can only center ourselves, that we will find some untapped well of genius or energy, something that will make us feel good and make us be successful, if we can only center ourselves. And that's not Christianity. Christianity is about de-centering ourselves. Ultimately, it's not about us as individuals. I am because we are. I know it's difficult sometimes to reach out like that. It's easier to be spiritual and not religious. When people say to me, I'm spiritual and not religious, I'm glad you're going to seminary, but I'm spiritual and not religious. It's harsh, but I often think that it's a selfish path to be spiritual. If climbing a mountain and going to yoga and hugging a tree is where it ends for you, that is selfish. That's inward looking. Being religious, like we are here today, it's decentering. The word itself, we get it from the Italian, which comes from the Latin, religare. Ligare means to bind. That's where we get our word ligament, what binds muscle to bone. And meaning again and again. We bind ourselves again and again, week after week. We reach out from ourselves, week after week, to get what's coming from this altar, to get the Eucharist, to reach out and get the stories that we hold so dear. Because these are the things that enable us to reach out to our neighbor, to reach out to our enemy, to clothe the naked, to give food to the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, care for the sick, to visit the imprisoned, to bury the dead. These are decentering actions. It's difficult in a world that is so exhausting to reach out in these ways again and again. I know that. We can feel empty, and we can feel unloved, and we can feel so unforgivable that we don't dare reach out to someone else and offer forgiveness. And in answer to that, I think St. Francis says it best. It's in giving that we receive. It's in loving that we're loved. It's in forgiving that we are forgiven. So, when you are tempted to set a table for one, at that table of spirituality, when you're tempted to think, I am, because I think, therefore I am, reach out. Follow the example of the Trinity. Reach out in love to your friends, to your neighbors, to your enemies. Reach out in love to God. And remember that I am because we are. Amen.